Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening for this online avid reader event with Paul Barclay and Lech Blaine discussing his quarterly essay, Top Blokes, the Larrikin Myth, Class and Power. My name is Jennifer Stevens. I'm the book club's manager at Avid Reader, and it's my very real pleasure to be hosting this event tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm broadcasting to you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge First Nations peoples and their connection to country. And tonight I would also like to honour in particular the sharing of culture through the telling of stories. I would like to warmly welcome you all and our speakers Paul Barclay and Lech Blaine to tonight's discussion of the quarterly essay, Top Blokes, written of course by Lech Blaine. And before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'll touch on just a few details. If you set your settings to speaker view, our guest speakers take up the screen space. You've all automatically been placed on mute and will remain so throughout the event. However, Lech is keen to answer your questions in the latter part of the evening, so please start sending your questions through as you think of them using the chat box. If you haven't seen it, you'll find the button that will open the chat box at the bottom middle of your screen. Your questions will come to me and I'll relay as many as we have time for in the Q&A period. I'd also like to mention that we have Top Blokes available to purchase at Avid Reader. We are waiting on a shipment, so if you do miss out, we will have copies arriving very, very soon. But I'll post the link in the chat box to purchase your copy of Top Blokes quarterly essay, and we'll let you know as soon as your copy arrives in store. So now I'd like to introduce Paul Barclay. Paul Barclay is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and broadcaster with an appetite for ideas and in-depth analysis and discussion. Paul has produced countless stories over more than 20 years for an array of programs on virtually all ABC radio networks. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Paul Barclay and Lech Blaine.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here. Always a pleasure to be at Avid Reader, even if it's Avid Reader via Zoom. I'm recording this discussion for my program Big Ideas on Radio National, so you can keep an eye out for that on RN. Australia has had a long larrikin tradition stretching way back to Ned Kelly and Henry Lawson, or so we've been led to believe. But is a lot of what passes for larrikinism essentially a fabrication? Has it been used as a form of class cover, a disguise for those who aren't larrikins really at all? And has this faux persona been exploited for political gain? Lech Blaine's quarterly essay, Top Blokes, the Larrikin Myth, Class and Power, examines a long line of larrikins and top blokes, and he remains unconvinced of the bona fides of many of them, including Scott Morrison, Bob Hawke and Kerry Packer, to name a few. Lech is with us tonight to discuss his essay. Welcome, Lech.
Hey, mate, how you going?
Very well indeed. You line up a kind of gallery of faux larrikins in your essay, including those I mentioned, but also there's Henry Lawson, Barnaby Joyce, John Eliot. I could name a whole lot more. I'm curious, though, what triggered this dissection of faux larrikinism?
Well, I grew up in pubs throughout country Queensland. My dad was a larrikin. I wrote a memoir which came out earlier in the year, which had a chapter called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Larrikin. And so certainly as a kid and as a teenager, I was a faux larrikin in some ways. Like I hammed it up and I did certain things to compensate for my lack of, namely my lack of athletic ability, because my first cousin was Alfie Langer, and so I who was Queensland's biggest larrikin, and so I could never measure up to him athletically, and so I tried to take a lot of his mannerisms and amplify them to the nth degree, and that got me in quite a lot of trouble as a teenager. And even later. And so my argument isn't so much that, say, someone like Bob Hawke, I think that Bob Hawke does have a a certain Larrikin streak, but I think that there are just certain mannerisms which were amplified and other mannerisms which were downplayed. And I think that that's just really interesting. It certainly mirrors my own personal experience. And then after writing about my own personal experience, I really wanted to dissect the way that this plays out on a macro level, which is the national, the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation.
Yeah, the essay is about class and politics as much as it's about Larrikinism. It's curious, why do you think wealthy, educated, or at least comfortably middle-class men feel the need to pander to the mythology of Larrikinism when they're really not Larrikins at all?
Well, I think that there's an egalitarianism running throughout Australian history. Sometimes that had really negative effects in terms of things like the White Australia policy, but there were like genuine impacts in the way that we designed our economy that were egalitarian for a very certain kind of person, and so I think that the labour movement in Australia was quite successful at establishing a lot of these things in practice, and so conservatives and people with wealth eventually realized that they needed to tap into those mythologies if they were going to have any success, certainly politically, but also just in terms of the way that they operated as public figures and as public personas.
Yeah, and politically, I suppose the imperative to pretend that you're an everyman is related to the fact that you don't want to be seen as a member of the dreaded elite, especially the urban, educated elite, the kind of most disparaged class of all, it seems these days, the kind of chattering, affluent classes from the city. So do you think it's partly about politically putting a bit of distance between yourself and those people that they want to feel free, politicians, to disparage?
Well, yeah, totally. And it's reached its sort of apotheosis over the past decade with the culture wars. But there is certainly this taps into something very deep within Australian history where we prioritise certain kinds of personas and certain kinds of myths. And a lot of the time they've come from this, they've evolved from this sort of Bushman type figure. And so now we see this playing out, even though Australia is such an urbanized country, we often see this conversation really focused on the rural issues in a very genuine sort of way, but then sometimes in a very insincere way when it's conducted by billionaires who are our biggest inner city elites.
Yeah, one of which you do write about, Kerry Packer, one of our richest Australians when he was alive, and a man with a proclivity for meat pies to such an extent that he would turn up at these fancy places where billionaires get together and shock everyone around him by insisting on being served a meat pie. What was that all about?
Well, he did it with rugby league as well. He rocked up to there's the story where John Quayle says that he took Kerry Packer to his first rugby league game at Redfern Oval, and he rocked up in tracksuit pants and ate a meat pie, and he was just one of us. And so I relate to that because I'm a kid. As I said, I'm a kid who grew up in a pub, and my dad didn't eat anything that didn't have red meat in it, and so he used to eat 5 or 6 meat pies a week. And the only things I ever saw were, steak sandwiches, rump steaks, meat pies, sausage rolls. And so I think that Kerry Packer was very much tapping into this figure, which someone like my dad, who was very politically incorrect, but he also was very egalitarian. And Packer, he was a complex character because he adored but also loathed his own father, and his father was very conservative, and that actually led him to side with Labor politicians such as Hawke and such as Richardson, and some of that was just out of convenience, but I think some of that was also he actually didn't want to be part of this the elite that he saw at Geelong Grammar, where he never fit in. And so some of it was just his own identity crisis sort of playing out as an adult and as this sort of extremely influential and rich individual.
Yeah, there's a factor there about not wanting to be seen as part of a class that you don't really identify with, even though you're extremely wealthy. The other paradox, though, is that Larrikinism intersects very much with anti-authoritarianism and a suspicion of people in power and authority. But many of the self-styled larrikins that you dissect are those with power and authority and money. So it's
and who are quite sympathetic to authoritarianism as well, like such as Kerry Packer. I don't think he was a great fan of. I think he's on the record as not being a particularly great fan of democracy, and a lot of those extremely rich tycoons are the same.
Yeah. I was thinking about another person that you talk about in the essay, Paul Hogan, and his alter ego, Mick Dundee from Crocodile Dundee, who was such a successful creation that a tourism campaign was based on him. And I'm led to believe many Americans still think that he represents the typical Australian. So much of the Australian archetype, the kind of identity that we seem to want to project to the rest of the world, is based around this image of the larrikin. Why do you think we are so invested in it?
Well, that arrived at a particularly interesting time because it overlapped. It's sort of, he'd been around for a while, but he went global just after Hawke had become Prime Minister. And it was interesting because this is a time in Australian history where we'd really never been, it was the start of a great boom. It was the start of the sort of deregulation of the Australian economy. A lot of these pillars of Australian egalitarianism were being stripped back, whether that was right or wrong. And there's a lot of economic arguments to say that that was the right decision. But it was, this paradox was that we really clung to expressions of authenticity and these personas that tapped into those ideas about egalitarianism at the same time as that a lot of these figures, and he was an actor, so you can say that he didn't have as much impact as people like Alan Bond, for example, who certainly tapped into this larrikin type figure while swindling huge amounts of money from the ordinary people who he was actually imitating.
I suppose the central political phenomenon or paradox that you discuss in your essay is how it is that conservative parties have managed to win over blue-collar voters or battlers from the Labor side, and how Labor in turn has become a party that appeals more to educated white-collar workers. Since the 1990s under Howard, the Liberals have garnered so many of these voters that in the last 25 years, there have been fewer than 6 years of Labor rule. And a large contributor to that is that they've pulled a chunk of voters out from Labor who in the past voted for them. How much of a contribution do you think this kind of larrikinism, this affected larrikinism, if you like, has made to the electoral success of the Conservatives?
Oh, enormously. Like I don't think that, look at someone like John Howard, for example. John Howard never presented himself as a larrikin, but certainly a lot of the myths that he tapped into around sport and around mateship, the way that he communicated, the way that he talked, was really tapping into this tradition and the ideas about egalitarianism. And even though his policies were, taking Keating and Hawke's deregulations to the nth degree, he was able to present this idea that he was returning Australia to this more normal place, this place where ordinary people could talk about issues and they wouldn't be judged or sneered at. And that, and so even if he wasn't necessarily a larrikin himself, he was talking to people who saw themselves as larrikins and who saw themselves as being sort of thrown onto the scrap heap, and that they weren't sort of as integral to Australia as they might have once been. And so that Labor, meanwhile, won people over. It wasn't all one-way traffic. Labor were winning people over from a lot of these urban seats, more middle-class sort of electorates. But on the balance, it's been far more successful for the Liberal Party than that drift, and that traffic has been far more successful for the Liberal Party than it has been for Labor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm using this term larrikin sort of interchangeably with, good blokes and everymen and that kind of collection of terms that you draw on, and you think of Howard, Abbott, Morrison, all of them have possessed elements of this sport-loving Aussie everyman, yet none of them come quite from the class background where that meshes entirely comfortably.
Well, yeah, no, not at all, and so that's a great, as like Morrison is another example. I don't think Morrison, if we're going to use a textbook definition of a larrikin, Morrison isn't presenting himself strictly as that, but he's tapping into. I think he's definitely tapping into that, and certainly for someone who had zero interest in rugby league or I think drinking beer, it became this very central part of his persona. And so people like my brother John, who would identify as a larrikin and who lionises someone like Bob Hawke, but also loved John Howard, he sees Scott Morrison as his natural sort of politician, because he doesn't, through this imagery, whether that's the beer, whether that's the footy, whether that's the high vis, whether that's doing the renovations around the house, it all taps into this idea that he is very egalitarian minded, and that he doesn't look down at the ordinary person, or that he's just a normal Australian, and that he's not one of these sort of snooty elites.
Yeah, his public persona seemed to change the closer he came to being Prime Minister. Can you talk about that? Do we know the moment when Scott Morrison became ScoMo?
There was an interview where Ray Hadley pointed out the fact that he'd recently changed his name on Facebook to ScoMo, and so I think that had been thrown around a little bit by journalists, but that was sort of the moment, and that was he'd been a treasurer, I think, for just over a year, and he was shaping up as potentially Turnbull's natural successor, and this was post as the start of 2017, so it was post Brexit, it was post Trump, and I think that this was where it really all fell into place for him in terms of the sort of politician that was really going to be successful in this kind of hyper parochial world, which when he entered politics, it looked like Kevin Rudd was going to be Prime Minister for a decade, and he very much presented himself as a Christian bureaucrat, as someone who was very compassionate, as someone who wasn't necessarily unfavourable to government intervention, which is a long way away from the person that he sort of reinvented himself as during this period.
Yes, and when Kevin Rudd employed that kind of ochre slang, you always got the impression that it was sort of ironic. rather than him really taking it on board. Whereas with Scott Morrison, there's a point at which phrases like "how good is Australia" start to creep in to his vernacular that weren't apparent beforehand. Similarly, there seems to be a moment where he materialises as this Cronulla Sharks rugby league fan, as if he's always been a rusted-on Cronulla Sharks fan. Something I should say that Anthony Albanese is not convinced about with Scott Morrison. Would it be too unfair to say that Scott Morrison just basically has created this affiliation with the Sharks?
Oh, I don't think that would be unfair to say. Like he was the local member for quite a while before he actually started showing any interest in them. So like that's it was really he picked his run well. They'd been all right when he first got there. They ran top 3. Then they had a massive period of with the Asada scandal. They were down and out, and he showed zero interest in them at all. They started coming good again around 2015. He became the number 1 ticket holder at the start of 2016. They won their first comp ever that year. And so he just went full ball and airbrushed. He was a rugby union fan. He was a very much a diehard rugby union fan. He airbrushed any sort of affinity for rugby union. He had a weird fling with the Western Bulldogs, the AFL team in Melbourne. He airbrushed any affinity to AFL to the extent, and it's one thing to do that, but to the extent that he actually referred to in interviews that the fact that he was real. He didn't, he's always been supported this team, and he's not going to go around pretending to be something that he's not. So his pitch was very much his authenticity. And one of the things that seemed to make him authentic was supporting the sport, which had historically been associated with the battler or with the sort of bogan type figure.
Yeah, I should say for the listener on the other side of the Barassi line, as we call it, who might not be as familiar with these things, the distinction between rugby league and rugby union, I lived in Queensland for 25 years, so I know this well, is an important distinction. I mean, union is the game of the private schools. League is the game of the masses. If you align yourself principally with rugby union, you very much run the risk of positioning yourself as a toff, something I'm absolutely sure that Scott Morrison would have been aware of, hence perhaps that repositioning as a Sharks fan.
Well, yeah, he would have come across as another Malcolm Turnbull or even Abbott to a certain extent, had a lot of those blokey mannerisms, but was always seen as being a little bit weird and not quite, you know, he was certainly never seen as completely ordinary. And so I think that you talk about the vernacular, and it's not even just publicly that he says this. You talk to people in the Liberal Party who say that he started talking like this to them, even these people that knew that he was putting this public persona on, and that it was like he'd almost convinced himself that he was this the biggest Sharks fan, and that he was this sort of blokey type figure, even though a lot of his history doesn't play that out.
I mean, he's not the only person that you accuse of laying it on a bit thick when it comes to the everyman kind of persona. But, you know, when you think about it, he is a Pentecostal Christian. He's also a political operator par excellence. I mean, he is the very embodiment of the political insider. Yet he has, it seems, quite successfully managed to turn himself into this ordinary bloke from the suburbs.
Well, yeah, he is the inner city elite that he constantly rails against. Like he lived in Bronte. It wasn't anywhere near as affluent as what it is now, but he benefited from where he lived, which was being close to some of the best schools and universities in the country, the access to jobs, the sort of connections that he had socially growing up, and so. I don't begrudge that to anyone to use that to the maximum, but to turn around and then constantly sort of belittle these people that in a lot of ways he actually has more influence and power than any of these like inner city elites that he constantly rails against. Like I think that he certainly belongs to a more invisible sort of inner city elite. Someone
like Gough back in the 70s got away with the fact that he was not a larrikin at all. And someone like, I suppose, Malcolm Fraser was sometimes seen as a cold patrician leader, once again, in no way putting forward this everyman persona. But you think of Paul Keating and how dreadfully unpopular he was by the end of his prime ministership, and his love of French Empire clocks and the music of Mahler. And obviously he was such an incredible contrast to Bob Hawke. And you do wonder whether or not the kind of way in which politicians present themselves today is very much a reaction to Keating and how sort of out of touch in the end he was seen as being.
Oh, totally. I think that not just Keating, but the success of Howard has completely reshaped. And Howard, he analysed very successly what rubbed people up the wrong way about Keating, but also what made Hawke so successful. He actually, and still does, like, seem to have like a very genuine sort of admiration for Bob Hawke. And I think that, as I said earlier, like Howard was as much as he sort of hemmed up the Canterbury Boys High type rhetoric and the tracksuits, he was no natural fit with the battlers that he was chasing after, but he was very skillful at being able to communicate in a way that made them feel like he wasn't condescending to them, that he wasn't looking down on them. And so, his success, and certainly the success of Bob Hawke before that, completely changed the ground rules in Australian politics. I don't think that if you look at the post-war leaders before that, there didn't really seem to be much public expectation at all that they needed to be one of one of the sort of one of the masses at all.
I mean, it's obvious, that you're pointing out this, paradox or hypocrisy on the part of politicians, even if people like Scott Morrison have been quite successful in creating this image of themselves. I suppose the obvious question, though, is doesn't everyone realise that, don't all voters realise that politicians do fabricate and embellish aspects of their own character and their own origin story in order to be electable? And do they just take this stuff with a grain of salt, or is it important to them?
I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important. I think that trust in politicians has never been lower. And I actually think that that's why Scott Morrison's persona was so successful, is because his constant references to the Canberra bubble, the way that he really pitted himself as an anti-politician, and that he wasn't going to engage in the insider talk, that he didn't really. The really curious thing in the lead up to the 2019 election was that Labor ran almost the perfect campaign. They brought all the former leaders together, all these leaders who'd hated each other. They wrote joint letters. Gillard and Rudd appeared together. Hawke and Keating wrote the letter, and it was very much. I think the final campaign event was a recreation of the sort of Gough event, and so it was very much. It was part of this like rich tradition of about like that really paid homage to politics and politicians and institutions, and Morrison just did none of that. It was like he just appeared from nowhere and had no predecessors, and he was just running it. He was like, it sort of transcended the Liberal Party in a way. And I think that to the average person who doesn't pay much attention to politics, that really appealed to them. There was a lot of other things going on. There was Clive Palmer was running his campaign. News Corp were running a vicious scare campaigns about various things. But I think that Morrison was able to make people feel comfortable when they went, well, we don't trust any politicians, but if we're going to trust anyone, it's probably going to be the guy who's beating up on them all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting election. And, I think the debate still rages about why Scott Morrison won and why Bill Shorten lost. I mean, the interesting thing about Shorten, and you point this out in your essay, is that he modelled himself very much on Bob Hawke. Problem was, he wasn't Bob Hawke. And Hawke's great strength was that even though he was an Oxford-educated scholar, he was also a union leader. And we didn't seem to mind the fact that, this guy that had been educated in one of the elite universities in the world in England could come back here and drink beer and, and kind of act in that Larrikin manner. We didn't say, oh, you're a hypocrite. We kind of liked him and related to him to some extent. But Shorten, of course, even though he was modelling himself on Hawke's kind of approach to politics and the kind of consensus type of, he didn't have any of that. And he did actually, I think you could argue, come across as a bit of a Labor machine product.
Yeah, and I think that Hawke, he became Prime Minister before I was, a long time before I was born. So I wouldn't, I'm not basing this on my personal experiences, either like interviewing him or watching him. Like this is, I'm saying this completely just based on my own reading and watching stuff in hindsight. But there was a sense, at least as far as I understand it, that he was running. He had picked a lot of fights within the Labor movement in the lead up to where he was, and so he was running against the machine in some ways, and he was seen as actually a repudiation of some of the ideology within the Labor movement. He had this Larrikin edge, but he was really pitching himself as this pragmatist who was going to bring the country together. The country is completely different now. Obviously, we don't have that groundswell of the Labor movement that it was in 1983, but also, Shorten, for again, I haven't met the guy. Apparently, quite a gregarious and sort of very blunt, easygoing guy if you catch him one-on-one, but it just didn't translate to television in the way that it did for Hawke. Like Hawke was brilliant, and he was able to really distill this idea of himself as being this Larrikin type figure constantly on news, just with in 3 words or less sort of thing.
It is one of the interesting things about politics, I have to say, as someone who's met a lot of political leaders in the flesh, very often, and I'm not talking about their policies or anything really, but very often they come across when you meet them in public as much more likable and relatable people actually than they do than the kind of construct of them on TV and radio. Look, I want to talk about your foster brother John, who I suppose in a way is a kind of litmus test voter that you use, a kind of one person focus group in a way, a reference point. He's a battler who votes Liberal. Tell us about John and what his political sympathies tell us.
Well, yeah, so John and my other brother, Stephen's a year older than John. My parents couldn't have kids, and so they fostered Stephen and John, who at the time, their parents were in Boggo Road jail. And so for a bunch of things, stalking Joh Bjelke-Petersen, kidnapping, it's a very long story, but they ended up with my parents at a pub just outside Bundaberg. And even though they had extremely similar upbringings, their lives diverged in sort of concrete ways. And so Stephen went to university, got a accounting and an economics degree, did a lot of travel at quite a young age, then settled in Perth, and now works as a craft beer rep. So as a result, it's totally changed his political priorities, his economic priorities. He didn't have kids till the age of 30, whereas John didn't go to university, got a job as a labourer straight out of high school, ended up working for my dad as a bartender at a pub, had twin girls at the age of 20. So he was very much focused at a young age on his on material outcomes because he had to make ends meet. It was extremely difficult. And so there was certainly at that time, like he was a battler. And a lot that sort of that sense of himself as I guess maybe not measuring up to someone like Stephen, who had done everything right, it shaped, I think, his political sympathies as well, because someone like John Howard was speaking to people like John. He wasn't speaking to people like Stephen. And so John, even though both my parents were Labor Party members, they were Labor Party branch members. Dad was a branch president. John ended up has voted for the Liberal National Party at every election since he was 18. So he really is an outlier within my own family. He's not like my other sister Hannah, who was actually biologically the sibling of Stephen and John. She votes for the Greens like Stephen does. She went to university. She's got a master's degree. And so John is this outlier, but I think that the differences in his own life and his own journey to Stephen and Hannah in a large way explain these broader drifts that we've seen right around the world in terms of the way that people like John, who don't have a university degree, have increasingly drifted from social democratic parties to conservative parties to centre-right parties. And so I don't think that he explains everything about Australian politics or world politics, but I think he's a very interesting person, both because he reveals those differences in a very concrete way, but also because he's just a great storyteller and has a great turn of phrase, and he's able to sort of distill his own opinions and his own experiences in quite an entertaining way.
As you say, a big fan of John Howard and a big supporter of Scott Morrison, and precisely the type of voter that you would think Labor needs to get on side if they want to form government. What do you think Labor would need to do to win over someone like John?
I don't necessarily think that they need to, as I say in the essay, it's not I don't include John because I'm saying that the Labor Party need to get him back specifically, or that, I think that he's not particularly interested in issues like climate change. So I don't think that I don't think that the Labor Party needs to chase his vote at all costs. But I think that the feeling that he gets from organised politics and the feeling that he gets from career politicians is a feeling shared by people who even still do vote for the Labor Party and who might be part of that sort of old Labor, regional Labor, rural Labor sort of tradition, which is that they don't particularly, they feel condescended to in terms of the language used, in terms of the sometimes the feeling that their jobs are expendable, that there isn't a plan for a transition, that, yeah. And so I just think, as I said, I don't think that Labor needs to do everything possible to win him back. Like, I don't necessarily think that he's going to come back to the Labor Party, but I think that the snobbery that he feels from people such as my siblings, such as myself, maybe as well, is a valuable lesson for progressives to learn in terms of the way that they communicate to this broader electorate, because the people who Labor needs to win back at the next election, a lot of them potentially gave their first preferences to One Nation at the previous election. So this is not sort of necessarily a fellow traveller of the sort of inner city progressive elite, or at least the sort of elite that is characterised that way by conservatives.
But to some extent, Labor does have to balance winning votes in North Queensland in mining seats, winning votes in the Hunter, for example, against the appeal for urban professional voters who do want action on climate change. And, as we know, this has been the central dilemma facing Labor for a long time now. Can you see a way in which it can appeal to both sets of constituents? People like your dad, for example, and the newer urban professionals who are kind of post-material voters?
I think so. I think that we've seen some pretty dramatic developments over the past few weeks in terms of the way that politics will be reported in the lead up to the next election, due to News Limited's campaign, and I think that climate change isn't going to be the sort of the as toxic of an issue for the Labor Party, and so I think that I think that it's not even just the rural or regional voters. I also think that there is, even on the fringes of cities, there is like a much more of a bread and butter focus on politics, and I think that that's what we've seen Labor have framed a lot of their communication, a lot of their dialogue since the last election on really removing any sense of themselves as being more enlightened than the average person. And I think that, I wouldn't make any bold or brave predictions, but I think that that's been subtle, but I think that that's going to have an effect at the next election.
We've spoken about Scott Morrison and John Howard and their electoral success, and how to some extent it's related to how they've presented themselves to the electorate. What about someone like Labor leader Anthony Albanese? Here is actually someone who was genuinely raised, it would seem, in a working class environment, grew up in a council flat with a single mum on a pension. In some ways a genuine kind of working class underdog. You'd think that in a country like Australia, where we like the underdog and we don't like the tall poppy, that there could be some appeal. But he's not really milking that origin story, is he, Albo? He's kind of carefully avoiding it in a way. Could he perhaps play a bit more on that, given how successful we've seen the Liberals in taking elements of that identity for their leaders? Well,
I think that he refers to it pretty frequently, and it's on social media. I do think that there will be a more, his whole campaign since becoming leader has been to really keep his powder for the election, and so I think that there will be a more concerted effort to tie all of this into the policies that Labor will eventually take. I think it'll be a pretty slim offering, but I think that they'll really focus on those sort of workplace issues, wages, childcare, and also their forthcoming sort of climate change plan. So I think that there will be a more concerted effort to tap into that. But the other risk that a Labor leader faces in tapping into those things is that they might get accused of playing the politics of envy. And so I think that's the other reason for caution. Like a lot of the voters who that Labor need to win over, some of them are blue collar, some of them, a lot of them are middle class as well. A lot of them might own investment properties. A lot of them are quite worried about, historically now, quite worried about their that Labor is going to, tank the property market, or that they're going to come for franking credits or so forth. And so I think that there is a sense that that a Labor leader shouldn't lean too heavily into class war, and I think that maybe explains why Albanese hasn't been beating his chest too much since he became leader.
You've got an interesting background yourself, Lech. You come from a working class family. Your dad was a dyed-in-the-wool Labor man. Then you went to uni and did your utmost to try and hide your own class background behind designer label polo shirts. Are you right? Tell us about that if you can.
Well, my parents came from pretty working class backgrounds. By the time that I was primary school, they owned a small business, and so my life was slightly different even to my siblings. I think by the age of 11 we were living in a brick house, and so it certainly felt like we were on an upward trajectory. And so I went to a Catholic school in Toowoomba. It progressively happened. I didn't try and reinvent myself overnight, but I was very much a kid I was a bogan kid who was moving through increasingly middle-class spaces, and then moved from Toowoomba to Brisbane for university. I had political aspirations. I had literary aspirations. I wasn't exactly sure which way it was going to go. But the one thing I was sure of is that people, like I was as a kid, bogans who were diehard rugby league fans weren't necessarily the sort of people who were populating the literary spheres of Australia or the entertainment spheres or so much the political spheres. And so I was very self-conscious about the way that my parents spoke and dressed, and I made a very conscious attempt to airbrush those mannerisms, and to the extent that I went on a fitness kick as soon as I got to Brisbane and lost a heap of weight and bought a heap of Ralph Lauren shirts and made a very sort of conscious attempt to really, if you had have spotted me, you would have thought that I went to a GPS school in Brisbane. And this was a reverse Scott Morrison. It was, because I hadn't really made peace with the contradictions between where my family sort of came from and where we'd sort of moved and where I was now as a result.
Yeah, your dad was, by the sounds of it, a genuine kind of a larrikin, someone who left school at 13 to work at an abattoir, and someone, as I say, who I suppose, like many people of his generation and background, felt a very strong identification with the Labor Party that went beyond perhaps just voting for it. Can you tell us a bit about your dad?
Yeah, well, it was a tribal thing. It was sort of he was from he was the youngest of a heap of children in Ipswich. His father had been a blacksmith on the Ipswich Railway. They helped build the Railway Rugby League Club in Ipswich, which later became North's Tigers, a club which produced Alan Langer. And so, but at this earlier stage, as my dad grew up, Ipswich was this place which rugby league, the Labor movement and the Labor Party was all extremely tight knit. And so a lot of these relationships in terms of marriages, in terms of friendship, were all built around these pretty intuitive egalitarian ideals. And so my parents met at a backyard in Ipswich, and the people who hosted the barbecue, the guy was a coal miner and his wife was the president of the Women's Mining Auxiliary. And so those were the sort of circles that they were moving in. And Dad was, as a result, he was he ended up becoming a publican. But he was extremely sort of politically incorrect in the way that he spoke. He didn't really look the part or speak the part, and that's what made him great, to be honest. But I think that it ended up producing. He named me after Lech Blaine, so we always had a pretty close intimacy surrounding politics, and that's why I had a lot of interest in politics. But we just had a fair few skirmishes when I was a teenager, as I really attached myself to this post-materialistic politics, and he really remained loyal, even though by this stage he was a business owner and he'd done quite well for himself. He remained extremely loyal to the idea of industrial relations and always protecting workers and issues that I, as a teenager who was growing up and never going to pursue a blue collar job, wasn't really interested in.
You once told your dad, the Labor Party will die if it doesn't modernise. You can't win a federal majority anymore by just speaking to the working class. Don't think that went down very well with your dad?
No, not at all. The response might have been a bit more colourfully spoken than what I actually printed in the essay.
I mean, you are, as I've said, a kind of member of the progressive political class that is essentially a post-materialistic class. I think in your essay, it's Terry Butler, is it, who says people like you are not sufficient for Labor to win an election, and those kind of views. So it is, the lens does have to widen. How does it widen? I mean, how does Labor get, as you said, those voters who might have been concerned at the last election that their negative gearing concessions would be taken away from them?
Well, this is a $1 million question, and it hasn't. We're going to see after the next election, because if the current plan doesn't work, well, then it's sort of like everything's out the window, because Labor's been extremely pragmatic, it's been extremely disciplined, it's been extremely focused. It hasn't picked a fight with the Liberal Party on stage 3 tax cuts, for example, which is something that sort of really tested me, because I was trying to chart the course of growing inequality in Australia, and this goes to the heart of it. But I guess the argument is that Labor needs to win. If Labor had won at the last election, we wouldn't now be moving on to tax cuts. If the Liberals win at the next election, what are they going to be moving on to next? And so that's the sort of thinking that, in terms of being as pragmatic as they've been. So I think that there is going to be a need for them to really differentiate themselves, and I think that that's probably going to come in the shape of climate change. I think that that is the issue that will be able to inspire the inner city political establishment, and also be able to make people in the regions and in rural areas feel like there is a plan. I think that the issue for Morrison now is that he's adopted the net zero, but he's also doing it in an extremely half-assed way. And he's also, his political party and the right-leaning media have really hammered home the fact that the Labor Party is a party of renewable jobs. And so if people start shitting themselves that there is going to be a transition and they are going to be left behind, I think they are going to want like a pretty serious level of investment in this transition. And I think that that's a real opportunity for Labor.
I mean, as you talk about in your essay, it was the Hawke and Keating government that profoundly changed the Australian economy. We opened up the country to the rest of the world. We pulled down the tariff wall. We deregulated the economy. And that fundamentally changed the place. It meant that a whole lot of unionised jobs, manufacturing jobs, industries were lost. New jobs were created that were not unionised. We oriented toward Asia. And for a long time, this was a very big point of pride for Labor, that they were the party that modernised and opened up Australia. But now, it's 2021. We've seen the march of neoliberalism, deregulation and globalisation. And as you say, a huge growth in inequality, the high cost, for example, of university education, which Labor facilitated when it brought in HECS. Has all of this come back to haunt Labor? Because, you know, the kind of modern Australia that they've created in a way has become the political territory that the Conservatives are more than comfortable to fight on.
Well, that's the issue, is that they did all this, and they rightly or wrongly, but they lost a lot of the socio-economic architecture that they had, which was the labour movement, and that's how power was traditionally distributed within the economy. And without that, it's extremely hard to actually achieve the kind of progress for workers that you know, we've had stagnating wages for quite a while now. People can't afford to buy houses anymore, and there's all these issues building up. They were so successful at it, and the issue was that they didn't even end up really getting a lot of the credit for it, because Howard came along, and by the time that the main part, or the most the longest part of the boom happened, Howard was the one that took credit for it all. And so it was actually the Liberal Party who have been able to dine out on the economic success of the Hawke and Keating reforms.
If we can kind of come back to where we started this discussion on Larrikinism and the kind of masculine top bloke, it's a style of politics that has been politically successful in terms of attracting male voters. I wonder how useful it's been, though, in terms of resonating with female voters, or those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Could it perhaps in some ways alienate those voters?
I think it has in some respects, but then in other surprising ways, it actually, this figure is sometimes quite successful with migrants. Someone like Scott Morrison, especially the religious side. There is a desire within those communities to really be part of a political mainstream. That's not universal, but there is certainly, it's not all it's not all migrant communities or all migrants are against someone like Scott Morrison. I think that he's actually been quite successful at taking some of them from, or the Liberal Party have been taking some of them from Labor. But I think that personally, yeah, I think that there's that the time has come for a different kind of federal leader to be able to emerge. I think that Gillard got absolutely smashed. I think it won't be as I think that the treatment won't be as harsh for the next female leader. And yeah, I think that we've started to see changes at a state level that I think will eventually play out at a federal level as well. Like if you had have said 20 years ago that an unmarried leader named Anastasia Palaszczuk would, be the Premier of Queensland for as long as she's been the Premier of Queensland, it would have sounded insane. So I think that we underestimate somewhere like Queensland or other regional areas. And I think that once we give the opportunity to people, they will actually back those kinds of leaders in.
Yeah, and clearly there are new models of Larrikinism as well. As you write, anti-authoritarianism doesn't need the vocabulary of the bush poets, the accent of Mick Dundee, or the imprimatur of the shock jocks and media tycoons to inspire social change. It sounds like Grace Tame and acts like Barus Bukhani and looks like Adam Goods. So it's very much contrasting the Australia of today with the myth of the Australia of yesterday. And I suppose the question is, how long is it before our politics starts to reflect that more contemporary image that you evoke in that paragraph? Well,
Australian politics is behind even places that we sort of sneer at, like America is actually even on a conservative level, like they're far more diverse than what we are here. And so I think that there is an issue in the way that parties, especially like conservative parties, they need to attract more women, they need to attract more migrants, more people of colour. And I think that, yeah, certainly progressive parties do as well. And I saw something recently in terms of like with Tu Lee, and I think it would have been great if she had been a candidate. And it's not just about just about diverse candidates. I think that it's great that have a coal miner in central Queensland who believes in a transition for climate change. And I think that if you create this really rich tapestry of coal miners from central Queensland and people like Thule in Western Sydney, well, then you actually start to reflect the diversity and the reality of modern Australia. And it's not actually one or the other. It's not the Larrikin or the Thule figure. It's actually creating this very diverse blanket of individuals and personas. And that's when people start to feel like their local communities are being represented and that their actual lived experience is being represented.
Yes, and there are different models of Larrikinism. I like the quote from the artist Abdullah, a descendant of convicts and the son of Muslims, who says, "I don't think the Larrikin is dead. I just think it's been co-opted by the toffs and their middle managers. It's a cultural appropriation by the working class, by the elite, made ugly by the swaggering confidence of power and wealth." Interesting. So it's not Larrikinism per se that we should be abandoning. It's perhaps a version of Larrikinism. If I can just fire one more question and then I'll go back to Avid, and if they've got any questions that have come through, I'll let Jennifer fire them. What I enjoyed about the essay, and what we don't read about much in Australia, is that you're really having a conversation with us about class. The politics of identity means that we do discuss race and gender a lot in Australia, but we still don't discuss class very much. Why don't we talk about class? And would these conversations be more illuminating if we did?
Oh, I think that if we discuss class more in Australia, then just on a personal level, I wouldn't have walked around feeling so much stigma and shame about who I was as a teenager, and I would have understood things a little bit better. And there is a class as a taboo subject in modern Australia. And that's partly because conservatives have been extremely good at accusing people who talk about class of playing the class card and appealing to the politics of envy. But it's also because some progressives have really vacated the field. They actually don't really pursue a class-based politics. And so I think that, it's not just because of the conservatives. It's also about progressives really at the same time as we pursue equality in all these other areas, that we really keep class at front and center of how we achieve change in modern Australia.
Great to talk to you, Lech. Plenty of food for thought in the essay. Well done, and I commend it to the Avid Reader audience. And what I'm going to do is hand back to Jennifer at Avid to wrap up the proceedings. And if you have got any questions, Jennifer, you can fire them to Lech. Thanks, Lech.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you, Lech, for such a fascinating conversation. It's been really interesting. We have had quite a few recurring questions relating to women in politics. And there is the question that has come up a couple of times, can there be female larrikins? And do you have any examples of female politicians who are able to embrace larrikin behaviour and get away with it? Or is it the preserve of men? And also the question of, could a woman of colour ever be seen as a larrikin? Are there LGBTI larrikins? Or is it purely from your research? Is it purely something that is coming across in male behaviour in politics?
Oh, I think that lots of women exemplify, what we associate with traditional ideas of larrikinism. If we're talking about anti-authoritarianism, and if we're talking about egalitarianism, I think that it's the people who are most disruptive in modern Australia probably aren't going to be white blokes, but they're the ones who are generally identified as larrikins. So I think that I interviewed Melissa Lukashenko, who certainly exemplifies in the most sort of eloquent and also profane way the best parts of what we think of as the Australian larrikin. I think that Julia Gillard, as a politician, she actually did exemplify a lot of those things. I think she toned them down once she became Prime Minister and tried to fit within the mold a little bit more, and you know, she was on at the time on a bit of a hiding to nothing. So I don't know whether it would have been that different otherwise. But she did have an ability to laugh at herself and take the piss, and you know, she could be pretty informal and pretty approachable and down to earth. So yeah, I think that whether we call them larrikins or not, I think that, yeah, women, and including women of color, are extremely capable of exemplifying all of the positive things that we associate with Australian identity. The issue comes with, you know, I interviewed someone like Lydia Thorpe, and she exemplifies a lot of the same things, but she doesn't want to be called a larrikin because she just associates the larrikin with too many negative things. And so, yeah, that was one thing that I sort of realized as I was writing this essay, was that, yeah, the word probably isn't really important. I guess the point is addressing the way that members of a conservative elite in Australia police public discourse and sort of accuse people who are trying to achieve social change of political correctness, even though a lot of the time they are the ones who are actually really adhering to a form of political correctness. I think that's the great hypocrisy in our public discourse, and that's sort of that was more important to me than the actual word, or the word itself, and who is a larrikin or who isn't, and so forth.
That sort of goes into one of the other questions that we've had, which relates to larrikinism when it's in fact fakery. And did any of your research direct you to an opinion on as to how the Australian public reacts when they see it as fakery?
Not really. Like, Australians like to think of themselves as being able to, that we don't have any tolerance for bullshit artists, but that's obviously not true, because a lot of the not just in the essay, but just more generally, like a lot of the most successful people in modern Australia are complete bullshit artists, and so I think that we do have that. We do like to think of ourselves that way, but at the end of the day, especially in politics, a lot of the people who decide elections aren't paying all that much attention to the biographies of politicians. They aren't measuring the contradictions or the discrepancies or the narratives. They're just making a gut level instinct based on, you know, these fleeting glimpses on the news every now and then. So I don't think that they're sitting down to deconstruct the essential truth of someone like Scott Morrison.
Thanks, Lech. Look, we have run out of time. There are some more questions, but we are out of time. But thank you very much for this great discussion tonight. I will remind you all that this fabulous essay is available at Avid Reader, and if you are somewhere else, we still encourage you to go into your local bookshop in Sydney or Melbourne and get yourselves a copy of the quarterly essay. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Lech, and thank you everyone for coming. It's been a great night.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Catch you later, everyone.